Have you ever heard the parable of the madman? Nietzsche wrote it in 1882 in The Gay Science, and it's one of those passages that, once you really hear it, you can't unhear. A madman lights a lantern in the bright morning, runs into the marketplace, and starts shouting, "I seek God, I seek God." The people standing around, most of them don't believe in God anyway, they laugh at him. Is God lost? They joke. Did he wander off like a child? And then the madman fixes them with this terrible stare and says, "God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers?" Now here's what most people miss about that passage. The madman isn't celebrating. He's not doing a victory lap for atheism. He's horrified. He says he's come too early, that this tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering, and hasn't yet reached the ears of men. The churches, he says, are nothing but the tombs and sepulchres of God. But people can't see it yet. They don't understand what it means for the highest values to devalue themselves. And that word, nihilism, that's the word Nietzsche uses for what follows, not just the absence of God, but the absence of any authoritative framework for meaning, for morality, for truth itself. The collapse of everything the West had built its civilization on. And Nietzsche saw this not as a local problem, not as a crisis of faith that a little therapy could fix. He saw it as the defining crisis of the entire modern world. Everything else, the political revolutions, the wars, the ideological experiments of the 20th century, all of it was, for Nietzsche, a symptom of this one underlying catastrophe. So what do you do when the foundations have crumbled? That's the question I want to sit with tonight. Because Nietzsche had an answer. A radical, breathtaking, terrifying answer. But he wasn't the only one who took the question seriously. There's another thinker, Leo Strauss, who agreed with Nietzsche that nihilism was the crisis of our time, who took the diagnosis with full philosophical seriousness, and who nonetheless concluded that Nietzsche's cure was worse than the disease. And standing between them, complicating everything, is Martin Heidegger, whom Strauss himself called the profoundest interpreter and at the same time the profoundest critic of Nietzsche. He said Heidegger is Nietzsche's profoundest interpreter precisely because he is his profoundest critic. Think about that formulation. It means you can't really understand Nietzsche without going through Heidegger, and you can't go through Heidegger without confronting everything Nietzsche left unresolved. What I want to argue tonight is that the battle between Nietzsche and Strauss over the cure for nihilism is not a dusty academic debate. It's the most urgent philosophical conflict of our time. And the reason it's urgent is that we're living inside it right now, whether we know it or not. Let me lay out Nietzsche's position first, because you have to feel its power before you can understand why Strauss resisted it. Nietzsche's diagnosis is devastating. He looked at European civilization and saw that the moral framework it had relied on for 2,000 years, Christianity, and behind Christianity, the Platonic metaphysics that Christianity absorbed, was dying. Not because someone had refuted it in a philosophy seminar, it was dying because people no longer really believed it in their bones. The values were still hanging around like furniture in a house nobody lives in anymore. People still said good and evil, still went to church on Sundays, still talked about truth and justice. But the living conviction underneath had evaporated. Nietzsche called this passive nihilism, just drifting along with inherited values that no longer have any vital force behind them. But then there's active nihilism, which is what Nietzsche wanted to provoke. If the old values are dead, then someone has to create new ones. Not discover them, create them. And this is where Nietzsche's vision becomes genuinely radical. He doesn't think you can just tinker with the existing moral framework, patch it up, add a secular wing. No, he wants to go beyond good and evil altogether. The philosopher of the future, for Nietzsche, is a legislator, someone who doesn't receive values from tradition or nature or God, but who imposes values on the chaos of existence through sheer creative will. This is the Übermensch, the overman. Not a biological superman, but a spiritual achievement. Someone who can look into the abyss of meaninglessness and say, I will create meaning anyway. Not because the universe tells me to, but because that is what the highest human beings do. They are artists of existence. They take the raw material of a godless, purposeless cosmos and shape it into something noble. You can feel the intoxication of that vision, and a lot of people have been intoxicated by it. But I want you to also feel the danger, because Nietzsche himself felt it. He knew that his ideas could be vulgarized. He knew they could be turned into slogans for brutes. All great things, he wrote, must first wear terrifying and monstrous masks in order to inscribe themselves on the hearts of humanity. The right reading of Nietzsche has always been a question. His Zarathustra went looking for disciples and never found worthy ones. The teaching itself seems to resist being turned into a doctrine. The moment you say, I am a Nietzschean, and start operationalizing his ideas as a program, will to power, eternal return, master morality, you may have already betrayed what was deepest in him. The mask might be eating the face. Now enter Leo Strauss. Strauss is one of the most misunderstood thinkers of the 20th century, partly because he was so careful and partly because his students have been so prominent. But on this question, the question of nihilism, Strauss is crystal clear. He agrees with Nietzsche that something catastrophic has happened. He agrees that the modern philosophical tradition, from Machiavelli through Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and all the way to Nietzsche himself, represents a series of waves, each one cutting deeper into the foundations. 3 waves of modernity, Strauss calls them. The first lowers the standards of political life. Machiavelli saying, let's deal with how men actually live, not how they ought to live. The second wave is Rousseau, who radicalizes this into historicism, the idea that all values are products of historical development. And the third wave is Nietzsche, who pushes historicism to its logical conclusion. If all values are historical, then none of them have any absolute authority, and the only honest response is to will new values into existence. Strauss sees this trajectory with perfect clarity. But here's where he breaks with Nietzsche. Strauss says, what if the whole trajectory was a mistake? What if the problem isn't that we haven't gone far enough forward, but that we took a wrong turn somewhere, and the solution is to go back? Not back to Christianity. Strauss isn't a religious thinker in any conventional sense. Back to classical political philosophy. Back to Plato and Aristotle. Back to the idea of natural right. The idea that there is a natural order accessible to human reason that tells us something genuine about how we ought to live. Not because God said so, not because tradition says so, but because careful philosophical inquiry into the nature of things reveals it. Now, I can already hear the objection. You can't go back? Nietzsche happened. Heidegger happened. You can't pretend the critique of metaphysics didn't occur. And Strauss knows this. He's not naive. He spent his entire career engaging with Nietzsche and Heidegger at the deepest level. But his argument is subtle. He doesn't say we should pretend the modern critique didn't happen. He says we should reconsider whether the modern critique actually succeeded. Maybe Plato was deeper than his modern critics realized. Maybe the classical thinkers already understood the problems that Nietzsche thought he was discovering for the first time. Think of Plato's cave allegory. People chained underground, watching shadows on a wall, convinced the shadows are reality. One person breaks free, climbs up into the sunlight, sees the real world. Then, and this is the crucial part, he goes back down into the cave. Why? Because political life happens in the cave. Philosophy happens in the sunlight. And the tension between them is permanent. It's not a problem to be solved. It's the permanent structure of human existence. This is what Strauss calls the eternal moment within which political history occurs. It's not a historical phase. It's not something we'll evolve past. It's the permanent human situation, the gap between the philosopher who sees and the city that needs its noble lies and sacred traditions. And Strauss thinks Nietzsche, for all his genius, missed this. Nietzsche thought the philosopher could step forward and legislate new values for everyone. Strauss says, that's a misunderstanding of what philosophy is. Philosophy doesn't legislate. Philosophy questions. It lives in the tension. The moment you turn it into a program for civilization, you've destroyed it. Let me sharpen the contrast by bringing in a figure Strauss explicitly opposed, Oswald Spengler. Spengler, the author of The Decline of the West, took Nietzsche in a very specific direction. For Spengler, the lesson of Nietzsche was blood, life, will to power, the vital forces that drive civilizations through their cycles of rise and fall. It's a biological, almost mystical reading, and Strauss rejected it completely. For Strauss, the point was never life or blood or cultural vitality. The point was always the philosophic quest for truth. The question is not which civilization is ascending. The question is, what is true? And that question doesn't belong to any civilization. It belongs to philosophy as such. This distinction matters enormously because when people today reach for Nietzsche to fuel political movements, left or right, they're almost always reaching for something closer to Spengler's Nietzsche than to what Nietzsche himself might have intended. They want energy, vitality, the will to dominate. Strauss is saying that's a vulgarization. The real stakes are philosophical, not political. Or rather, and this is where it gets really interesting, the real stakes are political precisely because they're philosophical. Which brings me to something happening right now that would have astonished Alan Bloom. In The Closing of the American Mind, published in 1987, Bloom, Strauss's most famous student, wrote that virtually every Nietzschean, as well as Heideggerian, is a leftist. He was describing the academic landscape of his time. Nietzsche had been absorbed into postmodernism, into Foucault and Derrida, into the academic left. The right wanted nothing to do with him. That is no longer true, not even close. There is now a conspicuous Nietzschean right. People on the political right are reading Nietzsche, quoting Nietzsche, building political identities around Nietzsche. The Nietzscheanization of the right, that's a real phenomenon, and it changes everything about how we receive Nietzsche politically. The question is no longer whether Nietzsche belongs to the left or the right. The question is what kind of Nietzschean you're going to be. And I think there are really only two options. The first option is what I'd call dogmatic Nietzscheanism. You take Nietzsche's ideas, will to power, the overman, master morality, the critique of Christianity, and you operationalize them. You turn them into a faith, a set of doctrines to live by and to organize political life around. You become, in effect, a Nietzschean fundamentalist. And there's a deep irony here because Nietzsche himself would have despised this. He hated disciples, he hated systems. He wrote in Twilight of the Idols, "I mistrust all systematizers and avoid them." The will to a system is a lack of integrity. The second option is philosophical Nietzscheanism. You take Nietzsche seriously, not as a set of conclusions, but as a provocation, an invitation to think more deeply about the fundamental questions. What is the good? What is the nature of truth? What is man? And if you follow those questions honestly, you end up not just with Nietzsche, but with Plato and with Heidegger. You end up back in the great conversation of philosophy itself. This is the road I think is actually worth taking because it doesn't close down thought into a political program. It opens it up into genuine philosophical inquiry. Peter Thiel, of all people, understood something about this. In his essay, The Straussian Moment, written after September 11th, Thiel juxtaposes two thinkers, René Girard and Leo Strauss, and the question he's really asking is a question about time, about whether esoteric knowledge, the kind of dangerous truths that philosophers have always concealed behind careful writing, whether that knowledge will eventually burst upon general awareness. Girard thinks yes. The apocalyptic trajectory of history means that hidden things will be revealed, that the scapegoat mechanism will be exposed, that there's no going back to sacred violence once you've seen through it. But Strauss says never. The chasm between the wise and the vulgar is permanent. It's not a historical gap that progress will close. It's a feature of human nature itself. There will always be a cave. There will always be shadows. And there will always be people who mistake the shadows for reality. The implications of this are staggering if you think about them. It means that the Enlightenment project, making all knowledge available to everyone, educating humanity out of its illusions, is for Strauss fundamentally misguided. Not because education is bad, but because the deepest truths are dangerous. They corrode the beliefs that hold political communities together, and political communities need those beliefs to survive. Now, I want to be careful here because this is exactly the point where Straussians can go wrong. And I say this as someone deeply indebted to Strauss. There's a danger, And this comes from a piece I think of as Straussian witchcraft. There's a danger that Straussians bewitch themselves with their own buzzwords. Esoteric writing, the theologico-political problem, natural right, Athens and Jerusalem. These are powerful ideas, but they can become incantations. You can mistake knowing the vocabulary for actually doing philosophy. The defense of philosophy, saying philosophy matters, philosophy is important, philosophy should be preserved, can actually replace the practice of philosophy itself. You end up defending something you've stopped doing. Straussians need to seek new devils and new devil's advocates, not just rehearse the same battles against the same usual suspects. And I think the thinker who forces this reckoning more than anyone else is Heidegger. Heidegger stands between Nietzsche and Strauss in a way that makes everyone uncomfortable. Strauss himself acknowledged Heidegger's stature. Again, the profoundest interpreter and at the same time the profoundest critic of Nietzsche is Heidegger. What does that mean? It means Heidegger understood what Nietzsche was doing at a deeper level than Nietzsche himself. Heidegger's argument, roughly, is that Nietzsche thought he was overcoming metaphysics, moving beyond the Platonic tradition, but he was actually completing it. The will to power as the ultimate principle of reality is still a metaphysical claim. It's still an answer to the question, what is the being of beings? And that means Nietzsche is still operating within the framework he thought he'd destroyed. If Heidegger is right about this, then the stakes shift dramatically. It's not enough to go forward with Nietzsche because forward with Nietzsche still leaves you trapped in metaphysics. And it might not be enough to go back with Strauss to the classics because the classics might also be entangled in the metaphysical tradition that Heidegger is questioning. What Heidegger opens up is the possibility that the entire framework, the entire way the West has asked the question of being since Plato, needs to be rethought from the ground up. Not by creating new values, and not by recovering old ones, but by learning to think in a way that precedes the value distinction altogether. I realize this is getting dense, so let me bring it back to something concrete. Why does any of this matter right now? Here's why. We are living through a political and cultural crisis that is at bottom a crisis of meaning. People feel it. The institutions don't command loyalty anymore. The narratives don't hold together. Left and right are in disarray, cycling through positions, looking for something solid to stand on. And Nietzsche is suddenly everywhere, not in philosophy departments, in podcasts, in political movements, in the online spaces where people are actually arguing about how to live. The Nietzscheanization of the right is significant, not because it means the right has one Nietzsche. It's significant because it provides, and I want to put this precisely, breakthrough access to the philosophical dimension of politics. For the first time in decades, people who are politically engaged are also asking genuinely philosophical questions. Not just what policy should we support, but what are values? Where do they come from? What is the good life? What kind of human being should we aspire to be? These are Nietzschean questions, and they lead, whether people realize it or not, to Plato, to Heidegger, to the deepest currents of the Western philosophical tradition. But here's the danger, and it's the danger I keep coming back to. Resolution and courage are not enough for man to become what he is if the question, who is man, has not been posed and thought through. You can be as bold as you want. You can will as hard as you want. You can declare new values until you're hoarse. But if you haven't done the philosophical work, if you haven't actually sat with the question of what a human being is, what truth is, what the good is, then your boldness is just noise. Your will to power is just power. And Nietzsche himself knew this. That's why he wasn't just a polemicist. He was a thinker of extraordinary depth and subtlety who spent his life wrestling with questions he knew he couldn't fully answer. Strauss knew it too. That's why he insisted on the primacy of the question over the answer. The philosopher isn't someone who has the truth and dispenses it. The philosopher is someone who seeks the truth, knowing the seeking might never end. And the city, the political community, needs to be arranged in a way that makes this seeking possible, even while the city itself can never fully participate in it. The tension is permanent. The cave is permanent. The light outside the cave is permanent. And the journey between them, that's philosophy. So where does this leave us? Honestly, with an unresolved tension. And I think that's the right place to leave it, because the tension is the point. Nietzsche forces us to confront the death of our inherited values and the terrifying freedom that follows. Strauss forces us to ask whether that freedom is real or whether it's just the latest illusion of a modernity that has lost its bearings. Heidegger forces us to ask whether both of them are still trapped in assumptions they haven't examined. The battle between Nietzsche and Strauss over the cure for nihilism isn't over. It can't be over because the crisis they diagnosed hasn't been resolved. We're still in the cave. We're still watching shadows. And the question of whether to go forward into a future no one can predict, or backward to a wisdom we may have lost, or deeper, into a thinking that precedes the distinction between forward and backward, that question is still open. What I find genuinely hopeful, though, and I'll end on this, is that people are asking the question at all. The fact that Nietzsche is being read again, seriously, outside the academy. The fact that people are engaging with Strauss, with Heidegger, with Plato, not as historical curiosities, but as thinkers who have something urgent to say about our situation. That's not nothing. That's actually extraordinary. For a long time, political philosophy was treated as a dead subject, something you studied for a degree and then forgot. But it turns out the questions never went away. They were just waiting. And now, in the middle of a civilizational crisis that Nietzsche predicted and Strauss feared, and Heidegger tried to think through to its roots, those questions are alive again. The real challenge isn't choosing between Nietzsche and Strauss. It's learning to think with the intensity that both of them brought to the question. It's refusing to settle for slogans, whether those slogans come from the left or the right, from the academy, or from the internet. It's insisting that philosophy isn't a luxury or a hobby. It's the one thing we can't do without if we want to understand what's happening to us and who we might still become. The madman in the marketplace smashed his lantern on the ground and said, "I have come too early. This tremendous event is still on its way." Maybe he was right. Maybe the full weight of what Nietzsche saw hasn't landed yet. But the fact that we're here, thinking about it, arguing about it, refusing to look away, that's the beginning of something. Whether it's a beginning that leads forward or backward or deeper, I honestly don't know. But I know this much: it has to lead somewhere that takes philosophy seriously. Not as a weapon, not as a brand, not as a set of buzzwords to bewitch ourselves with, but as the practice, the lived, difficult, never finished practice of asking what is true and what is good and who we are. That's the battle. And it's still going on.